The Coastguard's Watch. For 21 years, the coastal wind had set its rhythm by Walter Trewin, or perhaps it was the other way around. He walked the upper cliff path with a heavy silver pocket watch that did not lose a second a month. Arriving at the limestone outcrop overlooking Porthselden Cove exactly at 25 minutes past 10, every night, no matter the rain, no matter the dark. The men in the village set their clocks by his lantern passing the point. His precision was a fact of nature, dependable as the tide. And then, on a Tuesday in late October, the facts of nature broke. He arrived at the outcrop 15 minutes early. It was a small deviation, practically a rounding error in a lesser man's life. It got him killed before the tide reached its lowest point. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, here with you from Ohio. We are traveling tonight to the jagged, salt-scoured edges of the Cornish coast in 1952. It is a place where routines are carved deep into the rock, where a man's dependability is his most valued asset, and where that very dependability can be turned into a weapon. Have you ever considered how closely you are observed in your most ordinary habits? The people watching you are rarely looking for malice, but they are always looking. Tonight's story is about the danger of being perfectly predictable. The tide is retreating from the shingle, leaving the wet shale slick underfoot. Let us walk the cliff path together. Chapter 1. The Patrol That Was Late. The morning arrived, not with the bright, ringing clarity of a new day, but as a slow, grudging thinning of the gray coastal fog, bringing with it the pervasive scent of cold salt, damp wool, and decaying kelp. Miss Jane Marple sat by the low sash window in Mrs. Polly Verity's cliff-top cottage, her hands resting quietly upon the warm wool of her knitting, watching the sea. The water below was a slate-gray slab, fractured only by the white teeth of the offshore reef, where the groundswell broke against the submerged granite, dragging the shingle back into the deep, with a hollow roar like broken glass, shifting in a heavy canvas sack. She drew her woolen shawl, a soft, heather-gray garment that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, closer against the damp chill that seemed to seep effortlessly through the thick granite walls of the cottage. She had traveled to Cornwall to clear the lingering remnants of an autumn cold from her chest, accepting Polly's energetic invitation with the mild, unassuming gratitude that so often masked her sharp and enduring interest in the varieties of human temperament. Porthselden was a rugged, severe settlement, entirely lacking the manicured gentility of St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple had observed long ago that human nature was a hardy perennial that flourished with equal vigor among the salt-crusted rocks of a Cornish cove as in the sheltered flower-beds of a Hampshire vicarage. From her vantage point, at the sitting-room window, she could survey the entirety of Porthselden's narrow, vertical geography. The village clung precariously to the sides of a steep coombe, its slate-roofed cottages stepping down the ravine like a flight of uneven stairs, until they met the high stone seawall of the harbour. Beyond the harbour pier lay the wild, jagged coastline of the headland, where the cliff path traced a precarious line between the heather-covered moors and the open sea. It was a landscape that demanded constant vigilance from those who made their living upon the water, a place where carelessness was swiftly and permanently punished. The gulls banked and turned in the gray air, their shrill cries muffled by the thick bank of sea fog that rolled continuously off the channel, blanketing the headland in a cold, white obscurity that blurred the boundaries between earth, sea, and sky. In such an isolated maritime community, where the tides governed every domestic rhythm and the winter storms brought real peril to every threshold, the habits of one's neighbors were studied with an intensity that city dwellers could never comprehend. She did not discover the body herself. That grim intelligence arrived with Polly, who burst through the cottage's heavy oak door with an agitation that set the blue willow-patterned teacups rattling violently in their saucers upon the dresser. Mrs. Verity was a woman constructed entirely of sensible tweeds, robust health, and forthright opinions. A person who customarily met the small crises of village life with brisk efficiency and a loud, commanding voice. But on this raw October morning, her florid complexion had drained to the flat, bloodless shade of old parchment. "It is Walter," Polly gasped, leaning heavily against the heavy timber latch, as though the wind outside had hurled her into the hallway and left her pinned there. She did not pause to untie the damp woolen scarf from her throat, or remove her rain-spotted felt hat. "Walter Trewin. They have found him on the cliff path, Jane. He is dead." Miss Marple set her teacup down with deliberate care, ensuring the porcelain base met the saucer without making a sound. She did not ask whether there had been a tragic fall. The note in Polly's breathless voice carried no suggestion of an ordinary mishap. It possessed that distinct heavy vibration that accompanies an act of deliberate violence. "Where upon the path was he found, Polly dear?" "At the limestone outcrop," Polly replied, her voice trembling as she moved into the sitting-room and sank into the chintz-covered armchair beside the unlit hearth. "At the pause point, the exact spot where he always halts his patrol to inspect the cove. Constable Hines is standing guard over him now in the freezing mist. He says Walter's skull was fractured from behind by a terrible blow. And his silver watch." Polly paused, swallowing hard, her gloved fingers clutching the wooden arms of the chair. "Constable Hines told the milkmen that the crystal was shattered, and the hands were frozen at exactly 17 minutes past 10. The sergeant believes he slipped in the dark, struck his head upon the rock, and smashed the watch in the fall." Miss Marple received this detail with the serene, concentrated stillness of a woman examining a delicate piece of lacework for a dropped stitch. 17 minutes past 10. The precise figure embedded itself in her thoughts like a hard, polished pebble. Polly's letters over the preceding 6 months had spoken of Walter Trewin with affectionate exasperation. The man was an unbending human timepiece. For 21 years as a Coastguard rating and patrol officer, he had governed his existence by an unalterable naval discipline. Every night, at precisely 25 minutes past 10, Walter was known to halt upon that limestone shelf, turn his brass lantern toward the dark expanse of Porthselden Cove, and record the state of the sea. Not 20 past 10, not half past. He was a man who regarded punctuality not merely as a habit, but as a sacred moral duty that bound him to the order of the universe. And yet, on this one Tuesday night, his watch had ceased ticking at 17 minutes past 10. A man who has lived by the second hand of a clock for 20 years does not become careless in a single night, Miss Marple observed mildly, adjusting her spectacles with steady fingers. "If the watch stopped at 17 minutes past 10, Polly, it did not do so because Walter forgot how to walk along the cliff. It stopped because an external event violently interrupted his journey." "Jane, the cliffs are notoriously treacherous when the October gales blow up from the south," Polly insisted, her voice tight with nervous apprehension. "A sudden gust of wind, a patch of greasy shale, even Walter might have lost his footing." "He might have," Miss Marple agreed softly, "had he been walking at his customary hour. But if his watch was broken at 17 minutes past 10, he was walking 8 minutes earlier than his entire life's routine dictated. That is the truly singular circumstance. In my experience, when a methodical gentleman changes his habits without informing his neighbors, there is invariably a very pressing, private reason. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Selby, who was the head verger at St. Jude's for 35 years. Mr. Selby always unlocked the north porch at precisely 7:15 every morning of his life. The day he unlocked it at 20 past 7, the parish thought he had taken leave of his senses, but in truth he had observed that the curate was secretly borrowing the sacramental wine after matins, and wished to catch him unawares. Punctual people do not deviate from their schedule out of caprice. They deviate only when they are pursuing a purpose that cannot wait. I believe, Miss Marple continued, rising from her chair and retrieving her stout cherrywood walking stick from the copper stand by the vestibule, that a short stroll along the cliff path would be most beneficial for my chest. The morning air, though brisk, is wonderfully bracing. Jane, you cannot possibly walk up there now, Polly protested, half rising from her armchair with genuine alarm. The path is bitterly cold, the rocks are treacherous with sea slime, and the county police are already on the scene. I shall wrap my woolen scarf twice about my throat, my dear, Miss Marple replied in that mild, unshakable tone that brooked no contradiction. And the police are invariably very tolerant of elderly ladies taking their morning exercise. I shall remain entirely in the background, like a quiet shadow. The upper path was a narrow ledge cut into the sheer face of the headland, hemmed on the landward side by steep banks of dripping gorse, and on the seaward side by an uninterrupted plunge of 200 feet into the boiling surf of Porthselden Cove. The wind here was a physical antagonist, an easterly gale that whistled through the heather and tore the breath from the lips. As Miss Marple climbed the winding track, her boots crunching upon the loose flint, she paused several times to steady herself against the granite outcrops, observing the way the low clouds scudded across the bay, casting deep, bruised shadows upon the water. The rock shelf was slick with a treacherous film of moisture deposited by the sea fog, and in the crevices between the stones, clumps of sea pink clung stubbornly to the shallow soil. Constable Hines stood shivering near the limestone outcrop, an earnest young man whose damp blue uniform was plastered to his frame by the sea spray. A heavy tarpaulin of dark green canvas had been laid across a motionless form upon the limestone shelf, weighted down at the corners with heavy beach stones against the buffeting squalls. Beside the tarpaulin, a chalk circle marked the position where the broken silver pocket watch had been recovered from a cleft in the limestone. Miss Marple paused several yards away, leaning lightly upon her walking stick, her pale blue eyes taking in the topography with serene, comprehensive intelligence. She looked not at the grim silhouette beneath the canvas, but at the sweeping panoramic view afforded by the vantage point. The limestone outcrop hung directly above the mouth of the cove, commanding an absolute, unhindered view of the crescent beach, the dark entrance of the sea caves, and the narrow gap in the reef through which small craft entered from the open water. A man standing upon this ledge with a lantern could oversee every movement upon the shingle below. Conversely, any boat operating in the shelter of the cove would see that lantern flare against the sky like a beacon, signaling with mathematical certainty where the Coastguard stood. She noted the angle of the fractured stone shelf, the thin skiff of gray shale underfoot, and the deep, abiding quiet of the headland between the crashing rhythm of the rollers. Walter Trewin had reached this spot 8 minutes before his appointed time. He had broken the discipline of a quarter-century, and that single deviation, Miss Marple reflected with a sorrowful tightening of her lips, had cost him his life. Verity's cottage had given Miss Marple ample opportunity to reflect upon the peculiar nature of village routines. In St. Mary Mead, every garden hedge and gravel driveway possessed its own unwritten timetable. Miss Hartnell took her Pekingese out at 10:20. Colonel Bantry collected the Morning Post at 9:15, and the curate invariably called upon the elderly parishioners on Tuesday afternoons. When any of these minor domestic movements altered by so much as 10 minutes, the entire parish took note, not out of malicious curiosity, but from that deep, instinctive awareness that human habits are the visible scaffolding of order in an uncertain world. In Porthselden, Walter Trewin's nightly watch had served as that very scaffolding for an entire coastline. To dismantle it required more than casual carelessness. It required an overriding urgency that had pushed a disciplined veteran into the dark before his appointed hour. Chapter 2. The Station Log. The Porthselden Coastguard station was a low, whitewashed granite building that sat upon the seaward rim of the harbour wall, where the spray of high tide routinely dashed against its reinforced iron shutters. Inside, the atmosphere was saturated with the pungent, evocative aromas of a disciplined maritime life. The sweet tang of beeswax floor polish, the astringent sting of brass cleaner, the oily scent of neatsfoot oil applied to heavy leather sea boots, and the damp, comforting warmth of strong black tea stewing upon an iron stove. A heavy marine barometer hung beside the entrance, its brass bezel polished to a golden gleam, while upon the long workbench lay neatly coiled rescue lines, signal rockets and zinc canisters, and a large brass telescope mounted on a swivel tripod that commanded the harbor approaches. Framed regulations from the Board of Trade lined the corridor, their formal Victorian typography asserting the supreme authority of maritime law over the unpredictable waters of the Bristol Channel. Inspector Galt of the County Constabulary sat behind the duty officer's heavy oak desk, turning the thick, ruled pages of the station logbook with the slow, deliberate fingers of an official who trusted physical documentation far more than the fallible memories of human witnesses. He was a broad-shouldered, heavy-set man in his late 50s, whose gray tweed suit hung loosely upon his frame, his weathered face creased into lines of habitual, methodical skepticism. Beside him stood the local sergeant, taking down notes in a pocket ledger with rigid military precision. He greeted Miss Marple and Polly Verity with punctilious, old-fashioned courtesy when they were shown into the watchroom, though his expression made it abundantly clear that he regarded the presence of two elderly village ladies as a mild, if harmless, impediment to official police procedure. 21 years, Miss Marple, Galt remarked, his deep baritone voice rumbling in the quiet room as he tapped a blunt forefinger against the open ledger. 21 consecutive years this man has kept watch along this stretch of coast. In all that time, his night patrol records show a consistency that is almost unnatural. Depart station, 21:45. Arrive Cliff Pause Point, 22:25. Duration of halt, 10 minutes. Return to station, 23:30. Rain, gale, fog, or winter frost, never more than a 4-minute variance across 2 decades. The fisherman in the harbor used to say you could set your ship's chronometer by the swing of Walter's lantern. He was a veteran of the Grand Fleet, you see, served as a chief petty officer on HMS Iron Duke at the Battle of Jutland. Once a man learns that kind of naval precision, it becomes bone and marrow to him. Galt paused, turning 3 pages back with a dry rustle of vellum, his brow furrowing beneath his bushy iron-gray eyebrows. Until 3 weeks ago. Look at these entries, Mrs. Verity. Polly leaned over the desk, while Miss Marple, peering serenely over the rims of her spectacles, studied the dense rows of blocky, ink-inscribed figures. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, and entirely unadorned, the script of a naval rating accustomed to keeping accurate ship logs under gunfire. But throughout the month of October, the departure times had begun an unmistakable, creeping retreat. On October the 3rd, Walter had logged his departure at 21:40. On October the 11th, at 21:35. On October the 19th, at 21:32. And on the preceding evening, the final entry inscribed in his steady hand before he walked into the dark. The recorded departure was 21:30. He had set out from the warm watchroom a full 15 minutes earlier than his lifelong schedule demanded. A man does not dismantle 20 years' unbroken routine without a compelling purpose, Galt mused, rubbing his chin with the back of his hand. Had he formed a new acquaintance in the village? Was there a woman involved, or perhaps an illicit meeting upon the cliff? Walter Trewin, Inspector, Polly declared with vigorous indignation, had not looked at a woman with romantic intent since poor Martha died in 1937. He lived for his garden, his naval pension, and his patrol log. If he changed his hours, it was because he suspected something was amiss along that path. A Coastguard officer who notices an irregularity on his beat usually files a report with his station sergeant, Galt observed dryly. He does not conduct private maneuvers in the dark unless he has personal reasons for keeping his suspicions secret. Before Inspector Galt could elaborate, the heavy exterior door of the station swung open with a violent crash, admitting a blast of cold, salt-laden wind and the disheveled figure of Arthur Trewin. Walter's younger brother was 52 years of age, a wiry, sharp-featured fisherman whose face had been carved by disappointment, wind, and bitter grievances. He was dressed in a salt-stained woolen gansey frayed at the collar, his corduroy trousers caked with wet sand and grease, and he brought with him into the warm room the sharp, unmistakable stench of diesel oil, wet pilchard nets, and raw panic. "Is it true, Galt?" Arthur demanded loudly, his voice cracking with a harsh defensive edge that instantly set the room on edge. He stood in the center of the watchroom, his eyes darting frantically from the inspector to the open logbook, his rough, scarred hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "The boys on the quay are saying Walter was struck down on the cliff path last night." "He was, Arthur," Galt replied evenly, leaning back in his swivel chair and fixing the fisherman with a cold, piercing stare. "He was found dead at dawn by Constable Hines. We were about to send an officer down to your trawler to notify you." Arthur did not collapse in tears, nor did he display the quiet, dignified shock of a grieving brother. Instead, a desperate, calculating tension seized his features, his gaze dropping to the floorboards as if searching for a trapdoor. "And the insurance policy?" he blurted out, the words bursting from him with an indecent, jarring haste. "The £800 with the Prudential? Does it pay out if his death was accidental? I need to know where I stand with the bank." Inspector Galt's face darkened like a thundercloud over the bay. He rose slowly to his feet, placing his large palms flat upon the desk. "Your only brother lies dead on a mortuary slab in the village, Arthur. And your first thought is whether you can collect £800 from his life insurance. That is a remarkably cold-blooded question to put to a police officer." "We had words, Inspector," Arthur said quickly, stepping backward as if warding off a blow, his face flushing a mottled, angry crimson. "Everyone in Porthselden knows we had words outside the Black Swan 3 weeks ago. The bank is foreclosing on my boat on Friday if I cannot produce £50 for the new engine manifold. Walter had £800 sitting idle in the savings bank, and he refused to lend me a single shilling. He told me I was a feckless fool who deserved to lose his vessel. But I did not lay a finger on him. I was out on the water all night." "Where on the water, Arthur?" Galt asked quietly, taking up his fountain pen. "And who can vouch for your presence?" Arthur's mouth snapped shut. He looked away, his jaw working convulsively, refusing to meet the inspector's gaze. The silence in the watchroom grew thick and suffocating. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, observed the fine dark mesh of illegal gill netting caught upon the horn button of Arthur's coat, and the silver flecks of pilchard scales adhering to his oilskin cuffs. She said nothing, but her needles clicked in a steady, thoughtful rhythm. Later, as they walked back along the Harbour quay toward the village, Polly shook her head in profound disgust. "Arthur has always been a bitter, grasping creature, Jane. To speak of money before his brother is even in his coffin. And that reminds me. Mabel Trevithick at the post office was telling everyone this morning that she looked out of her upstairs window over the cove last night at 10:30 and saw a strange boat's light moving near the Smuggler's Gorge." "Did Mabel say precisely what time she observed this light, Polly dear?" Miss Marple asked mildly, pausing by the stone parapet of the bridge. "About 10:30, she said," Polly answered. "An ungodly hour for an honest fisherman to be creeping along the rocks without running lights." Mabel was setting her dough to rise by the kitchen stove, looked out toward the mouth of the cove, and saw a white light flash twice near the water level. "The police think nothing of it, of course. Inspector Galt believes Walter died at midnight, so a light seen at 10:30 seems entirely irrelevant to his theory. Miss Marple stopped walking, gazing out across the gray water where the white foam marked the jagged reef. 10:30. The details settled into her mind with the crystalline clarity of a mathematical proof. If Walter had died at 22:17, as his broken watch indicated, then Mabel's boat had been operating in the cove a mere 13 minutes after the fatal blow. As they left the Coastguard station, the salt air off the harbor felt heavy with the scent of damp coal smoke and wet granite. Miss Marple adjusted her woolen shawl, her thoughts turning over the strange atmosphere inside the watchroom. Arthur Trewin's desperate outburst had carried all the jagged, unlovely hallmarks of a man pushed to the brink of financial disaster. Yet it lacked the cold, calculating restraint of premeditated murder. In her long experience of parish human nature, people who shouted their grievances aloud in public houses and demanded immediate settlements from insurance companies were invariably their own worst enemies. But they were rarely murderers. Murder, real murder, required a degree of quiet patience and smooth composure that poor, angry Arthur could never hope to summon. Chapter 3. The Tide Table. Walter Trewin's cottage stood on the seaward slope of the headland, hunkered low against the Atlantic gales, like an overturned skiff. The whitewash on its thick granite walls was crusted with a fine, gray salt bloom that came away on the sleeve of Miss Marple's coat as she brushed past the stone gatepost. A narrow path of crushed sea shingle, edged with whitewashed cobbles gathered from the cove below, led to a heavy oak door that had swelled with decades of coastal damp until it required a sharp, decisive shove of the shoulder to open. When Polly pushed it ajar, the house gave up an exhalation of intense, preserved quiet, a smell composed in equal parts of beeswax, carbolic soap, dry peat smoke, and the faint, bitter ghost of dark plug tobacco long settled into the heavy woolen curtains. It was a bachelor's house, but more specifically, it was the house of an old naval rating who had never unlearned the discipline of the lower deck. There was not an object out of place. The brass fender before the cold hearth was polished to a buttery sheen. The fire irons stood upright in their cast-iron rack, like soldiers on parade. On the mantelpiece, flanked by a pair of Staffordshire spaniels that seemed altogether too whimsical for their owner, a heavy brass carriage clock ticked with a loud mechanical heartbeat that seemed to underline the profound absence of the man who had wound it every Sunday morning for 30 years. Framed certificates of naval service from the Great War hung upon the walls, their parchment yellowed with age, attesting to Walter's service aboard His Majesty's battleships with exemplary conduct. A small glass case upon a side table housed several polished brass shell casings, a pair of Zeiss naval binoculars, and a model of a three-masted schooner built inside a dimpled glass bottle, every spar and shroud fitted with astonishing microscopic precision. Miss Marple had accompanied Polly on a legitimate domestic errand, the return of an illustrated manual on maritime shrubs that Walter had lent to Mrs. Verity during the summer, but her attention was drawn instantly to the small oak writing table positioned in the deep embrasure of the sea-facing window. The room felt entirely defined by the character of a man who trusted routine above all mortal things. It was a space that tolerated no ambiguities and permitted no decorative fluff. Above the desk, pinned flat to the lime-washed plaster with 4 identical brass drawing pins, hung the official quarterly tide table issued by the Harbour's authority, printed in dense, tabular columns of deep indigo ink. Miss Marple approached the desk with soft, respectful steps. In the scullery at the rear of the cottage, Polly was busying herself inspecting the larder to ensure that milk and fresh bread were not left to spoil before the coroner's constable arrived to lock the premises. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, tilting her head so the pale autumn light fell squarely across the indigo columns. The margins of the table were covered with Walter's neat, blocky annotations in hard graphite pencil. Most entries recorded routine navigational data, wind directions, barometric pressure, the names of local trawlers returning through the narrow sound. But alongside the dates of the preceding 3 weeks, the character of the handwriting had altered noticeably. The pencil had been sharpened to a fine needlepoint, and the graphite had been pressed deeply into the cardboard grain. Beside the date of his death, Tuesday, the 28th of October, he had inscribed 2 lines of mathematical finality. Window, LT 2347, exposed 2000 to 330. Beneath that, inscribed with a pressure that had left a permanent indentation in the plaster behind the card, pause, 2225, repeat. Miss Marple stood motionless, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon the polished edge of the oak desk. The numbers were not merely passive records of the sea, they were the working components of an equation whose lethal meaning was beginning to emerge. The rocky spit and the shingle beach in Porthselden Cove, a cauldron of impassable surf at high water, lay dry, sheltered, and entirely accessible from the seaward approach between 8 o'clock in the evening and 3:30 in the morning. And situated precisely in the center of that 7.5-hour window of accessibility, fell Walter's immutable 10-minute halt at the limestone outcrop, 25 minutes past 10. For 21 years, Walter had believed his nightly pause was a solitary act of vigilance. He had not realized until very recently that an illicit enterprise had studied his habits with equal care, utilizing the precise 10 minutes when his lantern was fixed high upon the headland, as an absolute guarantee of their own safety below. When the Coastguard stood upon the limestone ledge, looking seaward, his back was turned toward the smuggler's gorge, and his presence high above confirmed to the boatmen that no other patrol was moving in the Coombe. And when Walter had finally grasped that his legendary dependability was being employed as a clockwork instrument by criminals, he had begun his quiet, solitary investigation. He had begun advancing his patrol by 5 minutes each week, to catch the operation in the act. Upon the leather blotter beneath the tide table lay a piece of lined writing paper, crumpled tightly into a ball at some point, and subsequently smoothed flat with heavy fingers. It was a letter in Arthur Trewin's violent, irregular scrawl, dated 4 weeks earlier. You sit there in your warm room counting your pension, Walter. You think because you never took a risk in your life, you are better than the rest of us. The bank will foreclose on the trawler by the end of November if I cannot find £80 for the diesel refit. You have £800 in the post office savings, and the insurance policy besides. If you will not lend it to your own brother, you are no brother of mine. You will look at my ruin, and remember that you made it. The letter remained unanswered. Beside it lay Walter's brass pocket rule, aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the blotter, as though the dead man had used its straight edge to dismiss his brother's emotional tempest with a cold, geometric finality. "Jane, dear," Polly called from the doorway, drying her hands on a clean tea towel, "I have locked the larder. It feels dreadfully intrusive, peering into a dead man's private affairs." "It is only intrusive, Polly, if one brings idle curiosity," Miss Marple replied softly, stepping back from the blue tide table. "When one is searching for the truth, an empty room is often the most truthful witness of all. It has no reason to deceive." She looked once more at the blue chart, the coordinates of tide and time etched permanently into her memory. The first half of the puzzle was clear. She knew the schedule of the water. But water was only half the shelter required by men who worked in the dark. The other half was the sky. To understand why Walter had died at 17 minutes past 10, she would need to examine the moon. Before leaving the cottage, Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the small bookshelf in the corner of Walter's sitting room. Beside a well-thumbed Bible and several official manuals issued by Her Majesty's Stationery Office on coastal navigation and lighthouse signals, sat 3 small, cloth-bound volumes of maritime poetry, their pages worn and softened by decades of careful reading. Walter had not been merely an unbending human timepiece. He had been a man of deep, silent contemplation, who found in the vast, mathematical rhythms of the sea a profound sense of spiritual comfort. To turn such a man's devotion to duty into an instrument for crime was an act of cold, cynical calculation that offended every principle of justice. Chapter 4. The Fisherman's Account. The formal interrogation of Arthur Trewin took place later that afternoon in the cramped, stifling interview room at the rear of the village police station. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp lime plaster, stale players' navy-cut tobacco smoke, cheap carbolic floor wash, and the pervasive, oily tang of old tarred hemp ropes stored in the basement lockers. A single high window admitted a flat shaft of gray October light that fell squarely across the scarred oak table. Inspector Galt sat in the center, his massive forearms resting upon the table, the Coastguard patrol logbook open before him like an open charge sheet. Beside him sat Constable Hines, his pen poised above a blank statement sheet, his young face pale and solemn with the gravity of his official duties. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a low wooden chair in the corner of the room, ostensibly waiting for Polly to complete an inquiry regarding a lost parcel of knitting wool in the front office. Her presence was indulged by Inspector Galt because she appeared to be nothing more formidable than an elderly lady absorbed in retrieving dropped stitches from a mauve woolen scarf. But her sharp, faded blue eyes missed not a single tremor of a suspect's hand or a flicker of an eyelid. Arthur Trewin sat slumped in the wooden chair opposite Galt, looking like a cornered animal that had exhausted its capacity for flight. His frayed woolen sweater smelled powerfully of diesel fuel, wet kelp, and cold seawater, and under the harsh light, the deep furrows of his weathered face were etched with exhaustion and terror. His rough, calloused hands, stained with engine grease and brine, gripped his knees so tightly that the white bone showed through the red skin. "Let us go over the timeline once more, Arthur," Galt began, his voice dropping into a relentless, rhythmic percussion that brooked no evasions. "Your brother Walter left the Coastguard station at 9:30 on Tuesday night. He was found dead at dawn upon the limestone outcrop, his skull fractured from behind by a heavy blunt instrument. You have no verified alibi between 9 o'clock and midnight. You were seen quarreling violently with him outside the Black Swan 3 weeks ago regarding an £800 insurance policy of which you are the sole beneficiary. And this afternoon, my constable found this letter in Walter's cottage." Galt slid Arthur's crumpled, angry letter across the oak table until it touched the fisherman's scarred fingers. Arthur recoiled from the paper as though it were glowing hot. "I wrote it in anger, Inspector," he cried, his voice cracking with a ragged, desperate intensity that echoed off the damp plaster walls. "I admit I was furious with him. Walter sat on his savings like a miser while my boat was about to be seized by the bailiffs. The diesel engine needed £80 for a complete cylinder refit, and without it I could not take the trawler out into the deep channel. I went to Walter on my knees, practically begging for a loan. But writing an angry letter is not murder. I never went near the cliff path on Tuesday night. I swear it on the memory of my mother." "Then where were you, Arthur?" Galt demanded, leaning forward until his face was barely a foot from the fisherman's. "You smell of salt spray and bilge water. You were on the coast that night. If you were not on the cliff path, produce one single witness who saw you elsewhere." Arthur's mouth twisted into a tight, agonized line. He stared down at his scarred knuckles, refusing to speak. The silence stretched out in the small room, heavy, suffocating, and damning. Miss Marple paused in her knitting, the soft blue wool looped over her slender finger. She observed the fine, dark monofilament fibers snagged upon the horn buttons of Arthur's jacket, and the telltale smears of silver pilchard scales upon his rubber cuffs. The spectacle reminded her irresistibly of a young curate she had known 30 years ago in St. Mary Mead, a mild-mannered young man named Mr. Barnes, who had looked the very picture of shivering, cornered guilt when accused of pilfering coins from the church restoration box. Barnes had stammered, turned crimson, and refused to provide an alibi for the hour of the theft. Not because he had stolen the church money, which he had not, but because during that precise hour he had been conducting a clandestine, highly improper courtship with the blacksmith's daughter behind the tithe barn. He had been entirely guilty of a minor social transgression, and had preferred to endure the suspicion of felony rather than reveal an indiscretion that would ruin his ecclesiastical career. Arthur Trewin was trapped in the identical dilemma. He had been night poaching in the protected breeding grounds off the headland, deploying illegal fine mesh drift nets within the prohibited 3-mile limit. To disclose his exact coordinates and produce his fishing companions would result in the immediate confiscation of his trawler, the destruction of his nets, and a heavy criminal fine that would seal his financial ruin instantly. He was a desperate man who chose to gamble with the suspicion of murder rather than confess to a regulatory offense that would destroy his livelihood forever. "Inspector Galt," Miss Marple remarked gently from her corner, her voice dropping into the tense atmosphere like a calming balm. "I notice that Mr. Trewin's cuffs bear the distinct scales of juvenile pilchards, which I understand run only in the deep water beyond the reef during an ebb tide. Is it not possible that a man might be engaged in an unlawful trade at sea that has nothing whatsoever to do with violence upon a cliff?" Galt frowned, glancing from Miss Marple's mild countenance to Arthur's startled face. "Poaching or murder, Miss Marple, the law requires an account of his movements. Until Arthur provides an alibi that can be verified by independent witnesses, he remains our primary suspect." "A man who is facing bankruptcy," Miss Marple continued with thoughtful serenity, "is often guilty of many desperate evasions, Inspector. But in my experience, people who shout their grievances in public houses and write threatening letters rarely plan methodical midnight assassinations. True malice is almost always quiet, polite, and exceptionally well-mannered." Galt closed the file with a decisive snap. The red herring was brightly colored and swimming vigorously in the inspector's net. But Miss Marple looked at Arthur's terrified, stubborn eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that the fisherman was innocent of his brother's blood. The true secret lay not in Arthur's poacher's nets, but in the boat-light Mabel Trevithick had witnessed moving in the cove at 10:30. The silence in the police interview room remained heavy, long after Arthur's outburst had subsided. Inspector Galt sat motionless, tapping his fountain pen against his blotter, his expression hardening into that obstinate certainty so characteristic of provincial police officers who have found a suspect with an obvious motive and an unverified alibi. Yet Miss Marple, watching from their quiet corner, with her hands resting upon her knitting needles, knew that the obvious motive was often the greatest impediment to discovering the truth. In village life, the man who looked most guilty was almost always guilty of something entirely different, using his silence to shield a private embarrassment rather than a capital crime. Chapter 5. The Harbour at Low Water. On the following morning, Miss Marple set out alone from Mrs. Verity's cottage to examine the geography of Porthselden Harbour at low water. The autumn sky was a canopy of bruised leaden clouds, and as she descended the steep cobblestone lane that wound between the whitewashed fishermen's cottages, the crisp highland air was displaced by the heavy, pungent aromas of the working quay. Drying seaweed, coal smoke, boiled crabs, diesel fuel, and the sharp alkaline stench of wet harbor mud exposed by the receding tide. The stone pier curved out into the bay like a protective arm, sheltering a dozen wooden trawlers resting tilted upon their keels in the glistening ooze. Gulls wheeled overhead, their harsh metallic cries slicing through the sound of slapping halyards and the distant roar of the surf breaking against the outer reef. Along the wooden fish landing stages, elderly mariners in dark blue woolen jerseys sat upon overturned crates, mending brown hemp trawl nets with flat wooden needles, their weathered faces impassive as they discussed the tragedy on the cliff. In a village where every man had lost a kinsman to the sea, death was treated with a stoic, unhurried solemnity. But Walter Trewin's violent end had cast a dark shadow of suspicion across the entire waterfront. At the eastern extreme of the stone pier stood the harbour master's office, a stout, square building of tarred timber and granite, designed to weather the fiercest winter gales. Through its salt-encrusted bow window, Miss Marple observed Daniel Scoble at work behind a high mahogany counter. Scoble was a vigorous, handsome man of 45, with broad shoulders, crisp dark hair silvering at the temples, and an easy, commanding presence that inspired immediate confidence among the local mariners. When the door chinked upon its brass bell, he looked up with a warm, brilliant smile, instantly setting aside his brass dividers and chart weights. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said briskly, stepping around the counter with an air of attentive, professional courtesy. "A bitter day for an elderly lady to be down on the quay. Can I offer you a warm chair by the stove? Or perhaps a cup of fresh tea? Mrs. Verity mentioned you were visiting from Hampshire." He was exceptionally civil. Indeed, as Miss Marple observed within the first 2 minutes of conversation, he was just slightly too civil, projecting an aura of eager assistance that seemed calculated to preempt every inquiry before it could be formulated. "You are most kind, Mr. Scoble," Miss Marple replied, leaning lightly upon her umbrella. "I was merely taking my morning constitutional. It is such a dreadful shock about poor Walter Trewin, a man of such remarkable, unbroken habits." "A terrible tragedy," Scoble agreed smoothly, his dark eyes clouding with an expression of practiced, somber regret. Walter was a rigid man, a martinet regarding Coastguard regulations, truth be told, but deeply respected. The cliff path is notoriously treacherous when the limestone is damp with sea fog. A single misstep on the shale, a sudden gust from the east, and a man goes over the edge before he can cry out. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes roving gently across the tidy office. "And the tides in the cove below the outcrop, they are quite formidable, are they not?" "Extremely dangerous," Scoble replied without hesitation, leaning against the counter and gesturing toward a large navigational chart pinned to the wall. "The tide rushes into the narrow Smuggler's Gorge at nearly 6 knots on the flood, cutting off the shingle beach within 20 minutes. Walter knew the danger better than anyone, but even an experienced officer can make a fatal miscalculation in the dark. A man walking along that limestone ledge without proper footing is courting disaster." While Scoble delivered his polished explanation of the local hydrography, Miss Marple's attention settled upon the floorboards beneath the harbour master's desk. In the shadow of a wicker waste-paper basket lay a small, concentrated mound of wet sand. It was not the coarse, golden gravel of the upper harbour beach, nor the dark, sticky mud of the boat slips. It was a fine, silvery, silt-like sand, containing microscopic flecks of mica that caught the light like powdered glass. The unique geological deposit found only at the extreme low water mark at the mouth of the Smuggler's Gorge, a shelf accessible from the land only during the lowest spring tides. And it was deposited in a dense, compact circle, exactly as though a heavy, water-soaked canvas sack had been set down upon the floorboards within the last 36 hours. Her gaze shifted to the corner of the shed, where a large, newly coiled hawser of heavy hemp rope rested upon a wooden packing crate. Miss Marple's silver-rimmed spectacles caught the faint glint of a dark ochre dye in the hemp fibers, and running through the center of each strand was a distinctive, bright scarlet thread, the unmistakable hallmark of heavy cordage imported from Lisbon, a specialized rot-resistant rope used exclusively for securing heavy maritime cargo in deep water. She remembered Constable Hines mentioning that several pale yellow fibers had been found caught in the rough limestone cleft beside Walter's body. She made no comment regarding the sand, nor did she glance a second time at the Portuguese hawser. She thanked Mr. Scobell warmly for his explanation of the tides, and stepped back out onto the stone pier. As she turned toward the village lane, she observed young Agnes Hartley, the harbour master's clerk, standing by the fish-curing sheds. The girl was clutching a ledger to her chest, her face pale, her eyes fixed upon Scobell's office window, with an expression of acute, vibrating dread. Agnes looked not like an employee admiring an efficient employer, but like a frightened accomplice who had witnessed a transaction she dared not name. When Miss Marple offered a gentle smile and inquired after her health, the girl stammered an excuse, pulled her woolen shawl tightly about her shoulders, and hurried away into the shelter of the smokehouse. Near the slipway, Miss Marple encountered Josiah Penrose, the reclusive sheep farmer whose land bordered the upper cliff path. Penrose was a gruff, bearded man who smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco. When Miss Marple politely inquired if he had been upon the headland on Tuesday evening, Penrose spat into the water and barked that he had been in the public bar of the Black Swan from 9 o'clock until closing time, a fact confirmed by 8 independent witnesses and the village constable. Penrose was eliminated entirely. The pieces of the puzzle were arranging themselves in Miss Marple's mind. Daniel Scobell was an exceptionally helpful man, who was taking immense pains to ensure that the police looked everywhere except at his own office floor. The smell of drying kelp and Stockholm tar grew stronger as Miss Marple walked slowly back along the stone pier. She paused for a moment beside a pile of lobster pots stacked against the harbor wall, watching the sunlight glint upon the fine mica flecks in the silvery sand beneath her boots. The geology of the coastline was unmistakable. The sand from the Smuggler's Gorge had a unique, sparkling texture found nowhere else along the bay. That such sand should be discovered in a neat, concentrated circle upon the dry floorboards of Daniel Scobell's office was a silent, unanswerable testimony that no number of charming smiles or polite explanations could explain away. Chapter 6. The Moonrise Chart. In the late afternoon, as the autumn sun dipped behind the jagged granite spine of the headland, turning the sea to the color of beaten pewter, Miss Marple walked down the high street to the village chandler's shop. The establishment of Mr. Tregear occupied a low, bow-fronted building near the fish quay, its interior smelling richly of Stockholm tar, raw canvas, boiled linseed oil, and decades of salt damp. Shelves rose to the blackened ceiling, crowded with brass binnacles, storm lanterns, marlin spikes, and heavy iron blocks. Mr. Tregear was an ancient, stooping mariner who moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a tortoise, peering over his steel-rimmed spectacles with the profound indifference of a man who had seen 50 years of shipping pass through the cove. "Good afternoon, Mr. Tregear," Miss Marple said in her most fluttery, disarming manner. "I wonder if you could assist an elderly lady with a small inquiry. My nephew Raymond, who writes such clever, modern books, though rather gloomy, I always think, is writing a historical essay on coastal navigation, and I promised to look up the exact lunar charts for this coast during the current month." Mr. Tregear grunted, wiped his hands on a greasy apron, and reached beneath the counter to produce a heavy, canvas-bound volume entitled The Western Harbour's Almanac and Lunar Tables for 1952. He slid the heavy tome across the counter with a dull thump. "Pages 42 to 48, ma'am," he said in a voice like pebbles grinding in a surf. "All the moonrises, tides, and solar declinations for the Bristol Channel and the Cornish coast. You won't find a more accurate calculation between here and Plymouth. We've supplied these tables to every Coastguard and pilot cutter for 40 years. Miss Marple turned the crisp, closely printed pages until she reached the entry for Tuesday, the 28th of October. She ran her gloved finger down the column of figures. Moonrise, Porthselden, 23:20 hours. She withdrew her small notebook and silver pencil from her reticule and carefully transcribed the notation. She thanked the chandler warmly, purchased a small tin of saddle soap to justify her presence, and walked briskly back up the steep hill to Mrs. Verity's cottage. Inside the quiet sitting room, Miss Marple sat at the circular mahogany table, laying out her documents like a player arranging a game of patience. Before her lay her transcription of Walter Trewin's tide table, the moonrise data from the almanac, and her neat notes regarding the broken silver watch. She conducted the calculation in her mind, step by methodical step. First, the dark window. The tide table established that the beach below the cliff was fully exposed and accessible from the sea from 2000 hours, 8 o'clock, until 03:30 the following morning. The lunar tables proved that the moon did not rise above the horizon until 23:20, 11:20. Therefore, between 8 o'clock and 11:20 at night, the cove was enveloped in total, absolute darkness, combined with an exposed beach. It was a 3-hour and 20-minute window of complete concealment. Second, the smuggler's requirement. An experienced coastal crew did not require 3 hours to unload a cargo of contraband spirits or high-duty goods. With modern launches and pre-arranged hiding places in the sea caves, the transfer of cargo from boat to shore required no more than 10 to 12 minutes. And to ensure that they were not surprised by the Coastguard, the smugglers had keyed their landing to Walter Trewin's legendary, unvarying 10-minute halt at the limestone outcrop at 22:25. While Walter stood high above, his lantern visible against the skyline, the smugglers below knew with mathematical certainty where the law was stationed. When the lantern moved on, the operation was complete, and the launch was already slipping back through the reef into the open sea. The police surgeon, examining the body in the sheltered village mortuary, had estimated the time of death as around midnight. If Walter had died at midnight, Mabel Trevithick's sighting of the boat light in the cove at 10:30 was an irrelevant coincidence. But Miss Marple knew that coincidence in a murder case was almost invariably a false premise constructed by human error. Fourth, the time stamp of the watch. Walter's watch had ceased ticking at 17 minutes past 10 o'clock. 22:17. If Walter, having discovered that his routine was being exploited, had advanced his patrol by 15 minutes, he would have reached the outcrop not at 10:25, but at 10:10. At 10:17 he had looked down into the pitch darkness of the cove, spotted the illicit landing in progress, and had been struck down by someone who climbed the path to silence him. Fifth, the temperature factor. Why had the police doctor estimated midnight? Miss Marple looked out of the window at the howling easterly gale. The cliff path was exposed to the bitter Atlantic wind, running 4 to 5 degrees colder than the sheltered village hollow. A body lying upon that freezing limestone shelf would cool at an accelerated rate, reaching the state of rigor mortis and heat loss consistent with a midnight death nearly 2 hours earlier. The calculation was complete. Walter had died at 22:17. The boat at 10:30 was the smuggler's vessel completing its flight. And the killer was someone who had access to Portuguese hemp rope, who tracked low-tide silt into his office, and whose authority over the harbor made him the master of the operation. Sitting at Mrs. Verity's mahogany table, with the almanac pages spread before her, Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a mathematician who has finally reduced a complex equation to its fundamental terms. The dark window of 3 hours and 20 minutes between sunset and moonrise provided the physical canvas. Walter Trewin's 10-minute pause provided the precise temporal key, and the 4-degree temperature differential between the exposed cliff and the sheltered village provided the forensic proof that reconciled the stopped watch with the doctor's mistaken post-mortem estimate. Everything fit together with the seamless precision of a master joiner's dovetail joint. Chapter 7. The Warrant. On Friday morning, the village of Porthselden was convulsed by the sensational news that Inspector Galt had formally applied for a magistrate's warrant for the arrest of Arthur Trewin on the capital charge of willful murder. The intelligence spread through the community with the speed of an incoming spring tide. At the post office, at the butcher's counter, and along the stone quays where the fishing fleet lay moored, the verdict of the village was immediate and unsparing. Arthur had killed his brother for the £800 of insurance money to save his boat from the bank. Outside the Black Swan, fishermen gathered in small, grim knots, debating the evidence in hushed tones, while down at the police station the iron gates had been closed to the public. Polly Verity returned to the cottage at 11 o'clock in a state of breathless, indignant agitation, throwing her market basket onto the kitchen table so hard that a jar of marmalade rolled across the oilcloth. "They have locked him in the cells at Truro, Jane," Polly exclaimed, sinking into a chair and fanning herself with a handkerchief. "Inspector Galt claims the financial motive is unanswerable. Dickie Bice went to the police station this morning to swear that Arthur was fishing near his skiff 2 miles off the headland on Tuesday night, but Galt dismissed Dickie's testimony as the perjury of an old drinking companion. It is monstrous. Arthur is a rude, ill-tempered creature, but he is no murderer." Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her teacup resting upon its saucer. She took a slow, measured sip of tea, her hand perfectly steady, her pale blue eyes fixed upon the distant horizon where the gray sea met the leaden sky. "Polly, dear," Miss Marple said softly, setting down her cup without a clink, "I wonder if you would be so good as to give me the direct telephone number for the Coastguard station. I find I have a small inquiry to make of the duty sergeant regarding the meteorological records." Polly stared at her friend in utter bewilderment. "Jane, the police have already taken Arthur away. What can the Coastguard tell you about a murder?" "A great deal, I believe, about the temperature of the wind," Miss Marple replied with a mild, tranquil smile. She walked into the hallway, lifted the heavy black bakelite receiver, and asked the village operator for the Coastguard station. When Sergeant Miller answered, his gruff voice crackling over the wire, Miss Marple adopted her most charming, apologetic tone. "Good morning, Sergeant Miller. My name is Jane Marple, a guest of Mrs. Polly Verity. I do hope I am not intruding upon your duties, but I have a small wager with a friend regarding the local climate, and I wondered if your station records show the exact difference in temperature between the village hollow and the upper cliff path during an easterly gale in late October." The sergeant chuckled over the line, clearly disarmed by the elderly lady's polite curiosity. "That is easily settled, ma'am. The village sits down in the sheltered coombe, so it averages about 10 degrees Celsius on these autumn nights. But the upper cliff path takes the full force of the easterly blow off the open water. Our anemometer station logs show that the path runs consistently 4 to 5 degrees colder than the village every single night. A body up there freezes in half the time it would take down in the street." 4 to 5 degrees colder, Miss Marple repeated softly, her pencil noting the figure upon the margin of an envelope. "Thank you, Sergeant. You have been immensely helpful." She hung up the receiver, her mind clicking the final piece of the forensic structure into place. The police surgeon had based his post-mortem estimate of the time of death upon standard cooling tables calibrated for indoor temperatures of 10 degrees. But on an exposed limestone cliff at 5 degrees Celsius, subject to a 20-knot wind, the body's rate of cooling was accelerated by nearly 40%. A body found in a condition suggesting a midnight death had, in physical reality, ceased living between 22:15 and 22:20. Walter Trewin had died at 22:17. The timestamp of his shattered watch was not a coincidence. It was the exact, mechanical moment of the crime. "Polly, dear," Miss Marple said, returning to the sitting room with quiet, formidable authority, "I should like you to send a message to Inspector Galt, requesting him to call here this evening at 6 o'clock. Tell him I have certain financial and physical evidence that will save him from committing a grave judicial error regarding Arthur Trewin. Before meeting the inspector, however, Miss Marple knew she had one final, indispensable task to perform. She had to look the real culprit in the eye and watch his camouflage shatter. The cold autumn wind rattled the sash windows of Mrs. Verity's cottage as evening began to fall across the headland. Polly sat in her armchair, looking from the telephone in the hallway to the papers on the table with growing awe. The idea that a simple inquiry regarding the meteorological records of an easterly gale could dismantle the county constabulary's entire case against Arthur Trewin seemed almost miraculous. Yet to Miss Marple, it was merely the application of ordinary common sense to the physical realities of the natural world. Chapter 8. The Discrepancy. The afternoon wore on, the pale October sun sinking steadily toward the gray horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the cliff tops. Inside Mrs. Verity's cottage, the sitting room felt suspended in time. The fire was lit, snapping quietly in the heavy iron grate, but the warmth did not seem to reach the edges of the room, held back by the creeping chill of the sea outside. The autumn light filtering through the salt-stained window was thin and entirely devoid of comfort, catching the dancing dust motes and illuminating the low, scarred wooden table that sat between the two armchairs. Miss Marple had arranged the table with the precise, unhurried care of a general laying out a battlefield map. She took a slow sip from her cup of Earl Grey tea, setting the delicate china saucer down without a sound. Before her lay the disparate pieces of the puzzle, smoothed flat and waiting to be assembled. On the far left sat the blue tide table, the paper stiff and official, annotated in Walter Trewin's blocky, uncompromising handwriting. In the center, she had placed the heavy canvas pages she had meticulously copied from Mr. Treger's almanac, detailing the moonrise. And on the right, written neatly on the back of a slightly crumpled butcher's envelope, were the temperature calculations she had derived from her conversation with the Coastguard duty sergeant. Polly Verity sat opposite her, watching with a mixture of intense fascination and creeping dread. Polly's sensible hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, the half-finished knitting on the chair beside her entirely forgotten. "The official time of death is an impossibility, Polly," Miss Marple began, her voice dropping to a register of absolute, unbending certainty that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. "The police doctor is a competent man, I have no doubt, but he has made a fatal assumption based on a fundamental lack of local knowledge. Walter did not die at midnight. The tide, the moon, the boat sighting by Mabel Trevithick, the stopped watch, and the cliff temperature, they only align in one specific, terrible configuration. And that configuration points directly away from Arthur Trewin." She reached out and rested a slender finger on her notes regarding the smashed silver pocket watch. "Let us begin with the watch. Constable Hines reported that the glass was smashed, the hands frozen at exactly 17 minutes past 10. The police have assumed that Walter slipped in the dark at midnight, and that the watch was broken during a subsequent fall. But a man as careful as Walter Trewin, a man who has walked that precise path for 21 years without incident, does not simply slip. If the watch was stopped by the terrible blow that killed him, or the heavy fall onto the limestone rock immediately following it, then the fall occurred at exactly 22:17. It is not a coincidence, Polly. It is a precise mechanical timestamp of a murder." Polly frowned, leaning forward slightly. "But Jane, if he died at 10:17, how does that help Arthur?" "Arthur could have been on the cliff at 10:17 just as easily as midnight." "He could have been, yes," Miss Marple agreed calmly. "But Arthur Trewin was pulling illegal nets in the deep water. We must look at what else was happening at 10:17. She moved her hand to the blue tide table. "Look at Walter's own notes, The beach was exposed from 2000 hours, 8 o'clock in the evening. Low water was not until 23:47. This means that at 10:17, the beach in the cove below was fully exposed, vast, and entirely accessible from the sea. She then tapped the canvas almanac page. Now add the moon to the equation. The moon did not rise last night until 23:20. Therefore, at 10:17, the beach was not only fully exposed, it was cloaked in absolute, impenetrable darkness. It was the perfect condition for an illicit landing. A landing, Polly breathed, her eyes widening. You mean the smugglers? Exactly, Miss Marple said softly, which brings us to Mabel Trevithick. She saw a boatlight moving in the cove at 10:30. The police dismissed this sighting entirely because they believed Walter was killed at midnight. An hour and a half later, long after any boat would have vanished. But if Walter died at 10:17, then Mabel's boat was in the cove a mere 13 minutes after his death. Polly shook her head, trying to process the timeline. They were there when he died? They were there, Miss Marple confirmed. They were still unloading their cargo on the beach below, moving it into the hidden gorge. And Walter, who had inexplicably altered the habit of a lifetime by arriving 15 minutes early, reached his pause point at 10:17 instead of his usual 10:25. He looked down into the dark, and he saw them. He interrupted them before they were finished, and one of them climbed the path to silence him. But Jane, the doctor, Polly protested weakly, clinging to the voice of official authority. The doctor said midnight. How can you be so sure he is wrong? Miss Marple smiled, a small, sad expression. She pointed to the butcher's envelope. The doctor based his estimate of the time of death on the ambient village temperature. He assumed that the cooling rate of the body would reflect a steady 10 degrees Celsius. But the cliff path is not the village, Polly. It is entirely exposed to the brutal easterly wind blowing straight off the water. The Coastguard duty sergeant confirmed it for me. The cliff runs 4 to 5 degrees colder than the village, consistently, every night. She smoothed the envelope flat, and that differential, a body exposed to the freezing easterly wind for 5 hours, cools significantly faster. It reaches the exact state of rigor and coldness that the doctor measured by approximately 22:15 or 22:20. Not midnight. The medical evidence, when corrected for the geography, perfectly supports the timestamp of the broken watch. Polly sat back, stunned. The fire cracked loudly, a sharp burst of sound in the silence. Then it was the smugglers. But who in this village could possibly organize something like that, right under our noses? Someone who knows the tides intimately, Miss Marple said, her voice turning grave. Someone who has the authority to manage a rough crew of men. Someone who knows exactly which heavy yellow hemp rope to use to secure the canvas cargo sacks, and where to source it from Portugal. Not to mention someone who tracks the fine silvery silt sand from the base of the smuggler's path into his office at dead low tide. Scoble, Polly whispered, the name slipping out like a curse. Daniel Scoble. Jane, he is the harbor master. He is the most respectable man in the village. It cannot be him. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. The leaping, controlled flames reminded her vividly of a man she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a Mr. Harbottle. Mr. Harbottle, she said softly, answering Polly's disbelief, ran a very prosperous, entirely respectable draper's shop on the high street. He sold the finest silks, the softest cottons, and he was universally beloved by the parish council. He also ran a very discreet, highly illegal, and utterly ruthless money-lending operation from the exact same premises, destroying families who could not pay his exorbitant interest. Both of his enterprises depended entirely on the exact same quality: his ability to be, in all public respects, entirely ordinary, deeply respectable, and thoroughly helpful. Daniel Scoble is cut from the exact same cloth, Polly. His respectability, his ready smile, his endless willingness to explain the tides and offer cups of tea to elderly women, it is all perfectly constructed camouflage, designed to render him invisible while he stands in plain sight. Polly stood up, pacing the small space behind her chair, highly agitated. "We must tell Inspector Galt. We must tell him immediately. Arthur is sitting in a cell right now." "We will tell him," Miss Marple said calmly, taking another sip of her tea. "But we must be careful. We cannot simply present an alternate theory without the final breaking piece of evidence. I need the confession." Polly stopped pacing, staring at her friend in horror. "Jane, you cannot go near him. If he killed Walter, he is a dangerous man." "He is a desperate man," Miss Marple corrected gently. "And desperate men are often surprisingly fragile when their camouflage is stripped away." She set her teacup down and looked directly at her friend with pale, clear, unwavering eyes. "Polly dear," she said, her voice carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a woman who has seen the absolute worst of human nature and survived it. "I should like you to send a message down to Inspector Galt at the station. Tell him I would very much like to speak with him. Not urgently, so as not to alarm him, but this evening, if it is convenient. I believe I can save him from making a very terrible mistake regarding Arthur Trewin." She would go to Scobell first. She needed to look him in the eye, and she knew exactly how to break the camouflage apart. The fire in the grate crackled softly, sending dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls of the sitting room. Miss Marple looked at the two blue teacups resting upon the tray, her thoughts returning to the sheer human tragedy that lay behind the mathematical puzzle. A father's desperate love for his ailing daughter, corrupted by the temptation of quick, illicit wealth, had collided with an old sailor's unbending devotion to duty. When men chose to step outside the law to solve their private troubles, they inevitably discovered that crime demanded a terrible compounding interest that could never be fully repaid. Chapter 9. The Harbour Master's Window. The confrontation took place the following morning. The heavy, oppressive fog that had choked the village had cleared entirely, leaving the harbour bathed in a thin, pale October sunlight that illuminated the stone quay with a stark, unforgiving clarity, without offering any actual heat. Miss Marple arrived at the harbour office alone. The harbour was fully alive, a symphony of maritime commerce. The air smelled sharply of salt, diesel exhaust, rotting fish, and old, tarred rope. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries harsh and demanding against the grey sky, while the tide slapped rhythmically against the wooden dock pilings, a heavy, wet sound like a heartbeat. Miss Marple carried her handbag and her walking stick, looking entirely harmless, a frail elderly woman on a mundane morning errand, stepping carefully over the thick hawsers mooring the fishing boats. Daniel Scobell was at his desk in the tar-papered shed, writing in a large green ledger. He looked up as she entered, immediately deploying his ready, handsome smile, though to Miss Marple's trained eye it seemed a fraction tighter than it had the day before, the corners of his mouth holding a tension that had not been there previously. "Miss Marple," he said, standing up smoothly, "how can I help you today? A question about the ferry timetable, perhaps? I know Mrs. Verity likes to visit her sister in Truro on Thursdays." "Not the ferry, Mr. Scobell," she said pleasantly, taking the wooden chair opposite him without being asked. The room was surprisingly quiet once the door was closed. The sound of the water against the quay felt very distant, muffled by the heavy timber walls. "I have a question about rope." The smile remained on his face, fixed perfectly in place, but it froze just at the very edges of his eyes. "Rope, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she said, her tone entirely conversational, as if discussing knitting patterns. "A very specific type of heavy hemp rope, pale yellow, woven with a distinct red thread running entirely through the core. Of Portuguese origin, I believe." She smoothed her tweed skirt over her knees, adjusting her spectacles. "I understand there is only one supplier in the entirety of Cornwall who imports that specific weave, and their records, which I am quite sure Inspector Galt will be eager to subpoena once I point him in the proper direction, show regular, voluminous purchases by the harbour master's own account." Scoble stopped writing. He placed the pen down on the ledger with exquisite, terrifying care. He was very still. His hands rested flat on the desk, not trembling, not moving a fraction of an inch. The only sign of his agitation was the careful, measured quality of his breathing. "I also," she continued gently, the pleasantness of her tone never wavering, "wish to ask about your daughter, Lily. I made a few small, discreet inquiries in the village this morning. People are always so incredibly willing to talk about family, aren't they? It is a terrible thing, a degenerative joint disease in one so young. And the clinic in Switzerland, the only place in Europe that can arrest the deterioration, I am told. It must cost a tremendous fortune, more, certainly, than a harbour master earns in 5 years of legitimate, honest work." She watched him intently. She had known a woman once, in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Gable, who had kept a very terrible, destructive secret regarding her husband's whereabouts for 20 years, maintaining an exterior of unbroken, radiant pleasantness the entire time. The pleasantness was the secret's protection, a polished shield against all suspicion. But when the pleasantness finally cracked under pressure, it cracked all at once, shattering completely, and there was absolutely nothing left behind it but raw ruin. Scoble was cracking now. The competent, helpful harbour master was vanishing right before her eyes, replaced by a desperate, exhausted, terrified father. "You needed one more run," Miss Marple said softly, the pieces finally clicking into their final, devastating configuration. "The biggest yet. You had it all timed perfectly, down to the minute. Walter Trewin was your clock. As long as he stood on that limestone outcrop at 25 past 10, holding his lantern, you knew exactly where he was, and you knew you had exactly 10 minutes of perfect safety to move the cargo up the gorge. You didn't plan to kill him, Mr. Scoble. I know that. But he arrived 15 minutes early. He looked down into the dark, and he saw you on the beach, managing the crew, and you panicked. You climbed the steep path, you struck him down to protect your secret, and you went back down to finish loading the boat, tracking the fine silt sand from the low tide mark right back into this very office." The silence in the shed was absolute. Scoble looked at her, his dark eyes wide and hollow. The handsome mask dissolved completely, falling away to reveal the agony beneath. "I was 3 months away," Scoble whispered, staring at his still hands, his voice thick and broken with unshed tears. 3 months from having enough for the clinic. He just wouldn't keep to his schedule. For 20 years he never changed. And that night, that one night, he had to be early. He closed his eyes, a violent shudder running through his heavy frame. He said my name, Miss Marple. He looked down into the dark, lifted his lantern so the light caught my face, and he called out my name. He gave me no choice. "I know," she said, her voice filled with a profound, heavy sorrow for the tragedy of it all. "I am deeply sorry for your daughter, Mr. Scoble. Truly, I am. But you cannot build a life on the death of a good man. The foundation will always crumble." Scoble did not run. He did not attempt to deny it further. He simply sat in the chair, his head bowed beneath the weight of his guilt, and waited for Inspector Galt to arrive. Arthur Trewin was released from custody before sundown, bewildered, aggressively angry, but free. Dickie Bice had finally found the courage to confirm the illegal fishing alibi. Agnes Hartley, who had known only enough to be terrified of her boss's secret midnight meetings, was cleared entirely of any involvement. The smuggling operation was dismantled completely by the end of the week. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked back along the cliff path. The wind pulled at her coat, smelling of salt and distance. Far below, the sea ground the shingle against the rocks, an endless, uncaring rhythm. She stopped at the limestone outcrop and looked out at the horizon. It was perfectly clear. The tide was marking its own schedule, rising against the stone with complete, magnificent indifference to what had happened above it. Walter Trewin's precision had been a virtue, a dedication to duty that anchored him to the world. But that same virtue, made predictable, had been turned into a weapon by someone else's desperate need. The coast did not pause to mourn him. The tide kept its own counsel, rising and falling exactly on time. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Porthselden on the afternoon coach for Truro, she stood for a few moments on the cottage terrace, looking out over the wide, slate-gray sweep of the bay. The gulls circled lazily in the cold autumn air, and far out beyond the reef, the white crests of the waves marked the eternal, unchanging rhythm of the Atlantic swell. Men came and went, with all their desperate schemes, their hidden sins, and their fragile routines, but the sea remained, vast, impartial, and untouched by human folly. Tonight, I asked you to consider how closely you are observed in your most ordinary habits. Walter Trewin did not die because he was careless. He died because he was the most reliable man in Porthselden, and that reliability became a key in someone else's lock. A quiet, unremarkable key, the kind nobody thinks to look for until the door has already been opened. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever found that a habit you thought was entirely your own was in fact being tracked by someone else? Something as small as a commute route, a routine stop, a predictable order at a counter? Leave your thoughts below. I read every one of them. Subscribe if you haven't already, so the next story finds you. There are more to come. There always are. This is David. Good night from Ohio. Be careful who you trust to keep time, for a man's most dependable habits may be the very thing that cannot be protected.